Well, I feel honored to be able to introduce our guest. I've known him for about 5 years, which is about the same time I've been with Sun Radio, and that's how I actually got to meet Joe. Joe, we're pretty sure, he's an attorney by trade, and he has an office right here in Sun City Center. He also has several offices around the state, not just here in Sun City Center. But he actually does a live radio program every Saturday morning at 8 o'clock that's heard all around the state of Florida. And we think it's the longest running continuous live show on radio in the state of Florida. Nobody's been able to prove that different. And it may be that he's got the longest running show in the country because he actually knows now that he has been on the air longer than Rush Limbaugh. And that's saying something. So Joe specializes in wills and trusts, and as I said, he does have an office here in Sun City Center, but he's not here to talk about your legal problems today. What he is here to talk about is the trial of Jesus Christ from a Roman law perspective. And how often can you hear that? He's done this same show every year on the radio just before Easter every year. So it's my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Joe Pippen.
Well, thank you and good morning, and I'm glad to be here. One producer at one of the radio stations told me that I might not have the longest running show in America because they think the Grand Ole Opry might be a little older than mine. So I'm not sure they're still on every week somewhere, but that might be true. Well, I'm here today to talk about the trial of Jesus. And the trial of Jesus is probably the most important trial that ever took place when you think about it. How could the most innocent person that ever walked this earth go through 6 trials, and actually 7 trials if you count the trial before the people? How could the most innocent person that ever walked this earth be crucified after all those trials? It's an amazing story. And it's the most exciting trial as far as facts go. And we all know that the end result had to be what it was. But how he got there, how did he get on that cross? What were the sequence of events that caused that and made that happen? Well, Jesus was a very popular guy. You know, he went around the countryside preaching. He raised the dead. He could feed 4,000 or 5,000 people at events. He had a big following. People were following him all around the countryside. And guess who that would upset? That would upset the priest, the Jewish priest. And there was a great body of law and a great system of law with the Jews. And they had the great Sanhedrin court. The great Sanhedrin court were made up of the most influential people at that time. There was 70. There were chief priests, scribes, and elders, and a chief priest, or a high priest. 70 people comprised this, basically, which was a court. They didn't have a jury system back in those days, so this was the court. And if you read through some of the scriptures, you know that the Jewish priest plotted against Jesus. They were the main body of force, and the Sanhedrin court had some guards that went out with Judas to identify Jesus and arrested him one night, as the story goes. Now there were 17 reversible errors in what happened in this whole trial, and any one of them could have been enough to have found Jesus not guilty, and the crucifixion never would have happened. There were 2 bodies of law. There were the great Sanhedrin court, the rabbinic law, and there was the Roman law. There was the law of the 12 tables. And there were 2 great bodies of law. The law of the 12 tables on the Roman side, they had 120 different sections of law, and 87 of those we still have today, almost in the exact form. So there were 2 great bodies of law. So what happened? The Sanhedrin court had 2 of their guards go out and arrest Jesus with the help of Judas in the garden. A couple of things were wrong with that. First of all, they didn't have a warrant. You had to have a judge sign actually a warrant back in those days to go arrest someone. You couldn't arrest people, believe it or not, at night. You couldn't have a trial at night. They took him to a chief priest's home, Annas, and Annas questioned him at night. So he was arrested at night. That was improper. That was a reversible error. Took him to a judge's house, and this wasn't a court in session. You couldn't arrest people at night. They couldn't hold court during the holidays, during the Passover. Two reversible errors. The priest questioned him, trying to get him to admit his guilt, and Jesus wouldn't talk to him. They then took Jesus to the chief priest's home, and they questioned him there. So actually we had too many trials going on that were improper. They were at night. They weren't in the court system. All the court things back in those days had to be an open court. It had to be public. So you have an arrest that was improper, and you have two trials before a priest trying to get him to admit of his guilt. And then he went before the great Sanhedrin court. And guess what? They had, most of you know the Bible and have read the Bible and have heard some of these stories, maybe not quite in this perspective I'm telling you about on the legal system, but the great Sanhedrin court sought false witnesses against him. It's like fake news. They wanted to make up a story. They wanted to convict him. The problem was the two witnesses that they came forth to testify against Jesus had different stories. Their stories didn't match. So you didn't have a valid witness. You didn't have a valid program against Jesus. And that should have been enough to stop it right there. Those were all reversible errors in the sequence of what happened on that Thursday night and thereafter. So the Sanhedrin court, even though all of that took place improperly, they found him guilty. And they wanted him crucified. The problem with, in that time, you had the Romans had the authority for capital cases. So they had to go plead their case to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of the time at that area. So they took him before Pilate, and Pilate says, "What charges do you have against this man?" And they basically said, if he wasn't guilty, we wouldn't have brought him here, without really explaining what he was guilty of. Well, the priests then knew that they really didn't have a case against them, so they made one up, more fake news. They said, this man has committed treason against Caesar. And so they tried to prove that case. So they changed what they were charging him with, that he was charged with, that he said that he could tear down the temple and build it in 3 days, and the witnesses had conflicting stories of exactly what he said, so they didn't agree. But when they got to Pilate, they knew they had to change the charge to make anything stick, so they changed the charge to treason. He said this man wants to be his own government, he wants to take money away from Caesar, and they made up a list of fake news lies about what was happening then. So Pilate heard the story, and Pilate basically says, "I find no fault in this man. You haven't proven your case. I find no fault in this man." And Pilate was concerned that the Jewish people in that area had complained to Caesar about 2 or 3 things that Pilate had done in the past, and Pilate didn't want to get in trouble basically with Caesar again. So he was trying to think of a way to appeal to how he could please the Jewish people who wanted this Jesus, who was roaming the countryside, healing the sick, raising the dead, feeding the poor, had a new message that they didn't feel comfortable with, so they wanted to get rid of him, so they had to do something. So here we are before Pilate. And Pilate says, "I find no fault with this man." So to appease them, he had the case transferred to Herod. He was the Roman emperor of Galilee, where Jesus was from, so he thought that would be an easy transfer to get rid of the case and transfer it over to him. So Jesus wouldn't talk to him. Jesus, he always wanted to meet Jesus, but Jesus would have nothing to do with him, wouldn't talk to him. And he asked him to perform a miracle. Jesus didn't, just ignored it. So, and he basically said, I find no fault with this man, and sent it back to Pilate. So here we are. We don't have a warrant. We don't have a open court public proceeding. We have false witnesses. We have Pilate saying that I find no fault in this man. Here it said there's no fault in this man. It comes back to Pilate. So what does Pilate do? Well, Pilate, he goes to the judgment seat, as you all know. His wife told him to release this man. And so Pilate just doesn't know what to do. So he says, I find no fault in this man. I release him to you to be flogged and scourged. Now, why would you do that to an innocent man? But the Jewish people then didn't like that either. So they started their little chant, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate must have been a very weak governor and a very weak judge and a very weak person because he listened to them. And he had a choice, though, or during this Passover season, he could release one person that had been accused of crimes that could be released during this time. So Barabbas was the one that they gave the people a choice. You know, do you want to release Jesus, or do you want to release Barabbas? So Pilate and the people said Barabbas. So he got released. And then the crowd started their chant, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. And Pilate again weakened and issued the order for him to be crucified. What was he guilty of? Nothing. Why did he do that? It was the pressure of the Jewish people who wanted him out of the system, so to speak. Now, I've done this on the radio lots of times, and some of the times I do this, I have live people calling into the radio show, commenting on into this. And several of my occasions of doing this show, I've had very angry Jewish people call the station and complain about me. And they think that I'm blaming all Jewish people for Jesus' death. Well, I'm not doing that. I'm just telling you what's in the Bible. I'm telling you the story that's in the Bible. And if you believe every word in the Bible like I do is true, that's your gospel, so you should tell the story like it is. And in fact, a Pope was commenting about that. It wasn't just the Jewish, it was the Roman people too that were involved in these trials. And that's true, they were. The Romans they had 3 trials before the Sanhedrin court, or the priests of the Sanhedrin court, and they had 3 trials before the Roman court. And then they had the trial before the people at the end. So there were really 7 trials. And all that's just laid out in the Bible perfectly for you. So I don't blame one person. And you know what? It doesn't matter. It had to happen. The Bible predicted it was going to happen. Jesus' own words predicted it was going to happen. Well, first of all, long ago, even before he made the world, God chose us to be his very own. His unchanging plan has always been to adopt us into his own family by sending Jesus Christ to die for us. Jesus knew, that by the way is Ephesians 1 through 4. Matthew 9 through 13 says, Jesus knew what they were thinking and asked them, why are you thinking such evil thoughts? I am the Messiah, have the authority over earth to forgive sins. But talk is cheap, and anyone could say that, so I'll prove it to you by healing this man. So he was had those healing powers. Matthew 10 gave power to 12, healed the sick, raised the dead, cast out demons. When King Herod heard about Jesus, he said, this must be John the Baptist, come back to life again. That is why he can do these miracles. For I had him arrested and changed him. Some Pharisees, no other Jewish, and some other Jewish leaders now arrived from Jerusalem to interview Jesus. Why do you disciples disobey the ancient Jewish tradition? And Jesus says in Matthew 16 through 21, now I got a little red flag by this one. He would suffer, he knew what was coming. He would suffer at the hand of Jewish leaders, that he would be killed, and 3 days later he would raise to life again. In Matthew 20, I will be betrayed by the chief priests and other Jewish leaders, and they will condemn me to die, and they will hand me over to the Roman government, and I will be mocked and crucified, and on the third day I will rise again. He's saying this ahead of time. He knew exactly what was going to happen with him in the arrest, the trials, the Jewish trials, the Roman trials. He knew ahead of time. And then it's all played out exactly like the verses said that he said they would. Now, isn't that amazing? Not really. I mean, Jesus has a plan for you and I. He knows what will happen with us in the future. He knows the day that we'll all leave this earth and join him. He knows all of that. He knows the future. And he definitely knew what was going to happen to himself, and he sacrificed himself and allowed it to happen. He didn't run and hide. He faced up to what was going to happen, and it had to happen. And so the trial, he was sent to be crucified. There were 17 different errors in the trial. I wanted to review those real quick. The errors are: no process could take place on the Jewish Sabbath or feast days. So that definitely happened. That would have been enough to reverse the end result if it had been enforced. No process could be started at night or even after noon for a trial before a regular Sanhedrin court. You know, this very same thing happened. This would be like a local judge here sitting in his home at night, deciding to send out 2 guards to arrest someone and bringing back to the judge's house for an interview. That's basically what happened here. So that would be totally improper back then and today. It was error for the chief priest, high priest acting as judge, to have sought words from the mouth of Jesus. You could not testify against yourself, so to speak. That was not admissible for any court to accept that and use that to find you guilty. And these 2 priests at their home both sought in their own home words for Jesus to say against himself. So it was error for Caiaphas, acting as judge, to have sought words from the mouth of Christ upon which to convict him without making a prima facie case with other witnesses. So they didn't have a warrant to go and arrest him. They didn't have a reason really to go arrest him. They had false witnesses that didn't even agree. All reversible. The high priest's palace was not the meeting place of the Sanhedrin. It was an error to hold trial there. It was an error for the priest to have acted as judge after publicly declaring that Jesus deserved death. Here's a judge already made up his mind. He didn't care what Jesus said. He didn't care what the witnesses said. They didn't have to agree. Jesus couldn't convict himself. In fact, the first 2 meetings, Jesus was silent. He wouldn't even answer these people. It was an error to have left him unguarded to the unrestrained license of the mob in the gallery of the palace of the home of the priest for an hour or more. You know, people spit on him. People punched him. People did all kind of things to him. He was left unguarded. They didn't really care. The Sanhedrin had no jurisdiction in capital cases, having been divested of that jurisdiction by the Romans 40 years earlier. So that's why they couldn't crucify him. That's why they couldn't stone him to death. That's why they couldn't do capital punishment to him. They had to have they had to convince the Romans that they were justified in their actions and complaint and prove it to the Romans, which of course they couldn't do either. The Sanhedrin, if existent, had no power except at a regular meeting. It was error for him not to appoint someone to defend him. Jesus had no counsel. Now, there's one interesting thing about the Sanhedrin court. If they had a unanimous verdict against Jesus, which they did, that would have been a reversible error. Because one of those 70 had to be his counsel. One of those 70 had to defend him. He had nobody to defend him. And they all voted against him. Reversible error. He had to have one advocate. One of his friends, Joseph of Arimathea, was his friend. And they said he didn't vote because he knew that if he had voted against him, that would have been enough to have a valid verdict. So he didn't vote at all. And everybody that did vote voted against him, so it was a unanimous vote against him, which was enough for an irreversible error. It was an error not to have warned the witnesses in the capital case in the Sanhedrin court. So guess what? If you were a witness, you had to participate in the execution. You had to feel strong enough that this person was guilty and wrong, and then you had to help in the execution. So they didn't have witnesses come tell untrue stories, basically, back then. The courts erred by not taking into consideration the guilt or innocence of Jesus. He didn't defend himself. No one there was his advocate. It was an error to take Christ as a prisoner on the first night. We talked about that. In modern times, it would have been an error to require Jesus to testify as a witness against himself, but in those days, in a trial for blasphemy, there seems to have been authority in favor of requiring what we know as self-incrimination. This will be discussed in detail in a later part of this, my notes here. So Jesus couldn't testify against himself, and if he did, it wouldn't have meant anything because they couldn't have used his own words against him. And today some of our laws evolved from these laws, the Roman laws, and today you can take the fifth. You don't even have to testify against yourself. Roman law required the trials to be public, and the private trial of Christ, both of them before the two high priests, was an error. It was an error to convict a man on testimony of false witnesses. Under modern law, a jury determines the credibility of witnesses. They didn't really have a jury back in those days. The Sanhedrin court was judge and jury, more or less. And Pilate, and the judge on the Roman side, Pilate, Herod, and Pilate again, had the authority to decide on the facts of the case to make decisions. Pilate, having announced Jesus not guilty, erred in permitting the verdict of the mob to stand. Now, who was in the mob? Who do you think was in the mob? Jewish priests consisted of most of the mob, because they were the most interested in having him removed from the scene, so to speak. The record shows Christ, after Pilate found no harm in him, was sent to Herod, back to Pilate, and turned over to be crucified. It was unlawful and therefore with error for the Sanhedrin to convict on the same day as the trial. They had to be a waiting period. So the Sanhedrin court, a very strong, powerful, legitimate, for the most part, body of law, totally did it the opposite of what they normally do for this trial. And the Romans would not normally be in favor of supporting a case like this, but Pilate was in fear of losing his job because Jewish people had complained to him on 3 or 4 different occasions, and his job was in jeopardy, so he went along with it. And very weak. So you had 5 courts and 6 trials in just a few days. Many, many different things happened that were not proper, and that's why it's one of the most, it's the most meaningful trial in your life, even way back then, because he died for us, and the method that he died was foretold, and he walked right into it freely and gave up his life for you and I. And that's the story of the trial of Jesus. I'll take a few questions if you have it, because we have maybe 5 minutes. Anybody have a question for me about any of this? All right, we'll turn it back to Pastor. Yeah, the Sanhedrin court, the priest. There were 23 priests, 23 elders, and 23 scribes, and a high priest. And they were, Jesus cleansed the temple a few days before all this happened. And there was an exchange rate of money that the priest made most of the money on that exchange rate. And he cleansed the temple and stopped all this activity of people being able to make so much money inside of a temple. And so the priests were angry about that. The priests were angry about the everything, him healing powers and healing, raising the dead, feeding the masses. They were very envious of him, and they devised a plan to get rid of him. Yes.
Why do you feel that Jesus did not say anything?
He didn't have to. He didn't have to defend himself, and he knew he wasn't guilty, and he knew there was a plot against him. I read the verse where they plotted against him and had false witnesses, and he was above that, way above that. All right. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned there was a following.
A what?
A following, a group of people.
A following, yes.
Yes. Did they not support him during his trial?
They seemed to be silent supporters. They weren't in the crowd that was yelling, "Crucify him," for sure. And they had, I'm sure he had 100 times the people that, if they had come to do that, they would have certainly drowned out those voices. But this was all meant to be. You almost have to think all of the horrible facts in this story and the horrible death of crucifixion. And sometimes I read out what crucifixion really is and how painful and awful, and how 5 hours on the cross is and what it does to your body. He volunteered he allowed it to happen. So he died for us in a horrible way. I don't know if you've seen the Passion of the Christ movie. I'm sure half of you have at least. That's a horrible death. Any other questions? Pastor, thank you so much for having me today.
Joe, thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Pastor Charlie, I don't know about you, but so often when we go through the passion, the crucifixion, the trial, as preachers, we don't get into that depth of looking at the misjustice that was served our Lord, to add to the insult. And so thank you, Joe, for that. Was very interesting, and we're so grateful that you would come and be with us this morning.